lovely sound of a Merlin engine powering one of the beautifully restored aircraft based here at Duxford Aerodrome. It's a familiar sound to many of the 250,000 visitors who come to this thriving part of the Imperial War Museum each year. But that aircraft, the Merlin that powers it, and its engine note are unique. The last surviving Sea Hurricane is powered by the only airworthy Merlin Mark III engine, making it the oldest Hurricane of any type flying anywhere in the world. Now based at Duxford, the Sea Hurricane Z7015 made its first flight for 52 years on the 17th of September 1995. 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days after the Sea Hurricane crew started work on this magnificent restoration project, giving a new lease of life to one of the world's rarest aircraft. David Lee, Duxford's Deputy Director, is responsible for all the Imperial War Museum's aircraft and decides how they best can be used to convey the museum's message.
In the early 80s, we didn't have a Hurricane at all at Duxford. Duxford's always been felt to be Spitfire orientated, and Hurricane has always been in some ways, as far as Battle of Britain is concerned, and that was the most important period from Duxford's history. The Hurricane was far more important than Spitfire, and we wanted to have a Hurricane at Duxford. When the Shuttleworth collection were looking for somebody else to take on and work on this Sea Hurricane restoration, they approached us and we said, yes, all right, we'll give it a go.
Chris Chippington, Duxford's conservation manager, coordinates the work of the volunteers and staff restoring the museum's aircraft.
We're trying to preserve as much as we can of the original aircraft that took place in this conflict, so that future generations understand what warfare was about and how it was conducted. All of our restoration conservation work is towards a static aircraft. The Sea Hurricane is unique in that it's the only aircraft the museum has restored to flying condition. It's important, obviously, because of its role in the Second World War and primarily its role in the Battle of Britain. I think the Hurricane in the public eye certainly has always taken second place to the Spitfire.
Although restored and now maintained at Duxford, the Sea Hurricane will eventually return to join the other aircraft in this unique collection of airworthy aeroplanes at Eldwarden Airfield in Bedfordshire. Jonathan Peel, Shuttleworth's general manager, oversees the running of the museum and the continued preservation of the collection.
The process that the Hurricane has now gone through is exactly the same process that our Spitfire Mark V went through. That was originally restored here and spent some of its time alternating between here and Old Warden for the first few years of its life. As you know, it's now long-term based at Old Warden. The slogan that we've used for many years, "Time flies at Old Warden," applies just as much to the people who work there as it does to what happens.
The Shuttleworth Trust still own the airplane, yes. The deal is basically if at any time in the future they decide to sell the aircraft, they have to offer it to us first. And we have a quite considerable, I must admit, far more than I'd ever envisaged, stake in the airplane now, and the amount of money we put in to bring it up to flying standard. In the latter stages, they have become much more involved in it, involved in the timber work, in the fabric work and the painting. So they have got more involved in the last year or so. But most of 99% of the work has been done here at Duxford with the present team.
The Sea Hurricane restoration and its progress has, for many years, been a focal point for Duxford visitors. But now it's airworthy again. How will the Imperial War Museum operate a Shuttleworth aircraft?
The Shuttleworth will operate it, and they'll provide the pilots and the operation of the aircraft. The first 2 years it'll be based at Duxford, operating from Duxford with a Shuttleworth team maintaining it and operating it. After that, the next 2 years, it'll be on a 50-50 basis, half-time here and half-time at Shuttleworth. We've left the period after that open.
The agreement between the Shuttleworth Collection and the Imperial War Museum means that the Sea Hurricane's future is now secure. But this story is about its past, about the stubborn dedication of the Hurricane team and their 9 years love-hate relationship with this aeroplane.
Squadrons of the RAF are going to play a decisive part in winning the war.
The history of the Sea Hurricane is just one chapter in the overall story of the Hawker Hurricane. To understand its evolution from a land-based fighter to carrier aircraft, we must go back to the origins of the Hawker Hurricane itself. Sir Sidney Cam's first military aircraft design was the Horsley, under the direction of W.G. Carter, chief designer at Hawker. His first design to be built in significant numbers was the metal-framed Hawker Hart. This was followed in 1930 by the Hawker Fury. Both aircraft were powered by the Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, and several design variants and types were developed from them, including the Demon, the Ordak, Osprey, Hind and Hector. This ex-Afghan Air Force Hind, meticulously restored and flown by the Shuttleworth collection, is a fine example of Cam's design progression. It clearly shows the profile that was to emerge as the Hurricane. On the 6th of November 1935, the prototype Hurricane K5083, powered by a Rolls-Royce PV-12, or Merlin as we now know it, took to the air at Brooklands for its first test flight, piloted by Hawker's chief test pilot, PWS George Bullman. Based on the success of the test flights and in anticipation of an Air Ministry order, Cam proved his confidence in the Hurricane by setting up production at Kingston for 1,000 aeroplanes. In December 1937, the first 9 Hurricanes to enter Royal Air Force service joined Treble 1 Squadron at Northolt to replace their ageing Gloucester Gauntlets. These were the first out of an initial Air Ministry order for 600 that would increase over the next 7 years to a production total of nearly 15,000 aircraft. The history of the Hurricane is an epic story, too vast to relate in any one documentary. The Sea Hurricane, however, is a small but very important chapter in that story. The Hurricane was never intended for carrier duties. Its evolution from land to sea was out of necessity rather than foresight. That Cam's rugged design was quickly adapted for Fleet Air Arm use when needed is further credit to its versatility. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the Fleet Air Arm was a very young branch of the Royal Navy. Hugh Popham, Fleet Air Arm historian who flew the Sea Hurricane in combat, explains.
Well, you've got to go back really to the 1917 when the old Royal Naval Air Service was merged by Smuts of all people with what was then the Royal Flying Corps, so there was one service.
It's already a service of great tradition. In the last war, as the Royal Flying Corps, it was part of the army, and as such performed...
Jan Christian Smuts was a South African general who drew up the plan in 1917 for a single air force that would absorb both the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Flying Service. His plan was accepted by the War Cabinet, and the Royal Air Force was the result. His plan worked well for the formation and development of a land-based air force, but was to have serious consequences for the future of flying in the Royal Navy.
The Navy had no control over its own pilots, aircraft or anything else until later on, until the 30s, really.
It wasn't until 1937 that the Royal Navy regained control of the Fleet Air Arm, but the transition was far from smooth. Officers with flying experience were few, and the naval aircraft issued to the Fleet Air Arm were old and of obsolete design.
It wasn't until just before the war that the Fleet Air Arm got its own service and its own aeroplanes, but of course by then it was too late because all available aircraft manufacturing was going to the RAF.
The main frontline carrier aircraft were the Skua, Albacore, Fulmar and Swordfish, like this beautifully restored and maintained pair operated by the Royal Navy's historic flight.
Fascinating thing about the Fleet Air Arm is that it had rotten aeroplanes. It was when I knew it first, it was a small service, but it always had this feeling of terrific spirit. I think partly because the aeroplanes were so awful, you know.
The Admiralty's attitude to aircraft was as it was to ships. They should never be built for a single purpose or flown by a single pilot without observer or navigator.
Well, the idea was originally that they would spot for the guns of the battleships. I mean, this was there, plus a certain amount of reconnaissance, and then eventually torpedo carrying.
The necessity for dedicated fighter aircraft had never been envisaged by the Admiralty at the outbreak of war, and in fact their use had been ruled out after exploratory tests at the Royal Aircraft Establishment with Hurricanes.
The Admiralty didn't believe you could operate a single-seater monoplane from a carrier.
They were to be proved wrong in the Norwegian campaign by the Royal Air Force. In June 1940, 46 Squadrons Hurricanes had been shipped to Norway to cover the troop evacuations and had been successfully flown off the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious to operate from hurriedly prepared airfields in Norway. Following the rapid German advance, Squadron Leader Cross received orders to either destroy his Hurricanes or send them with the ground crews to the far north coast. Here the aircraft would, if possible, be dismantled and shipped home by freighter. Cross considered both plans to be a waste of valuable aeroplanes. Following consultations with the captain of Glorious, flew 46 Squadron's 10 Hurricanes out to the carrier, now steaming at maximum speed into wind. They'd weighted their Hurricanes' tails with sandbags in the rear fuselage, but in the event, they all landed on with plenty of deck to spare. All 10 of 46 Squadron's Hurricanes landed on board Glorious with only one minor incident, damage to Cross's tail wheel. Sadly, Glorious was caught en route to Britain by the German capital ship Scharnhorst and her escort Gneisenau, and sunk with the loss of all aircraft and 1,515 men. Only 43 survived, including Squadron Leader Cross and his Flight Lieutenant Jameson, both of whom went on to have long and distinguished careers in war and peace.
It was tragic, really. But I think that was a very important event, because if the RAF could do it without hooks, then surely the Fleet Air Arm could do it, you know, on a proper aircraft carrier with hooks and all the rest of it.
One other significant chapter in the Sea Hurricane story was prompted by the menace of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, long-range reconnaissance bombers operating out of Bordeaux-Mérignac, which were harassing convoys in the Atlantic, far from the reach of shore-based fighters. The first solution to this problem was for ships to be fitted with catapult rails, on which a fighter could be launched for one attack on the shadowing Condor. This left the pilot with the choice of flying to any land within range or parachuting back to the ship after combat. The Fleet Air Arm was equipped first with 4 fighter catapult ships, ex-banana boats with Royal Navy crews, and pilots of 804 Squadron, Fleet Air Arm. Late in 1940, 35 Mark I Hurricanes were converted with catapult spools for use on fighter catapult ships. CAM, or catapult-armed merchant ships, were similar to the Fleet Air Arms, but cargo-carrying ships, crewed by merchant seamen and volunteer Royal Air Force pilots from the newly formed Merchant Ship Fighter Unit at Speke, Liverpool. These were the first Sea Hurricanes, or Hurricats. But in the event, they were seldom used in anger. Out of the 200 CAM ships planned for in 1940, only 35 were ever converted, sailing on 175 convoy protection voyages.
I mean, a CAM ship, you know, it was a terrible decision to have to fire this thing off. And you knew that was the only one you had, and you wouldn't get it back. But then, of course, from there we moved into the Woolworth carriers, mostly American, which were a lot better than ours, actually, because I served in one of them, the Campania, which was a British one. It was terrible. But, we gradually drew in all these American Woolworth carriers, and that was the beginning of proper convoy protection, all the rest of it.
A further link with the Fleet Air Arm that's made Duxford an appropriate place to restore the Sea Hurricane is the secondment of naval pilots to Royal Air Force squadrons during the Battle of Britain. One of the Fleet Air Arm pilots, based here under Douglas Bader, was Lieutenant R.J. Cork. He gained his first experience flying Hurricanes for the Royal Air Force long before they were introduced to the Fleet Air Arm. Cork served here with distinction and went on to become the Navy's top scoring pilot, flying Sea Hurricanes, but sadly he was killed in a flying accident in 1944. Late 1940, it became apparent to all concerned that there was, contrary to naval philosophy, a great need for a high-speed, single-seat, carrier-based fighter. The Hurricane, with its rugged versatility, was the only suitable aircraft available in sufficient quantities for conversion. And in 1941, the Fleet Air Arm started converting pilots. Men with Hurricane experience, like Cork, were to smooth the hurried transition and lead the way with tactics learnt in combat during the Battle of Britain. The first true Sea Hurricane, with arrestor hook, catapult spools and naval radio fit, completed test flights following conversion of a prototype by Hawkers. The subsequent Sea Hurricane conversions were handed over to General Aircraft Limited at Hanworth, who produced their first Sea Hurricanes by mid-1941 and went on to complete nearly 700 conversions for the Royal Navy. This aircraft was one of that first batch converted. And out of the 700 Sea Hurricanes, it's the only one left in existence. Researching Z7015's own personal history has taken Owen Dinsdale, the team's historian, almost as long as the restoration itself.
It was started here by another team that the Duxford Aviation Society put together. We took it over as a kit of parts. Keith and I have a saying that we start off with a colour scheme and work back from that.
Records proved that this aircraft's centre section had been laid down at the Hawker Aircraft Works Kingston as a Mark I Hurricane in 1939. But this was the first twist in the tale, as no further records existed until a standard Mark I Hurricane recorded as Z7015 arrived from Canada nearly 2 years later. In an effort to secure a safe manufacturing base away from the impending war in Europe, Hawkers signed an agreement with Canadian Car and Foundry, based at Fort William, or Thunder Bay as it's now called, in Ontario, Canada. Every drawing, part and jig of the Kingston assembly line was microfilmed and shipped to Canada. There is a possibility that the 1939 Kingston-built centre section was shipped out to Fort William as well, as a pattern for the 1,451 Hurricanes that were built over the next 3 years in Canada. Returning to Britain as part of the complete Hurricane Z7015 in 1941. This is one possible solution to the Hurricane's British-Canadian crossbreeding. The other is that the entire centre section was replaced during repairs following a landing accident, not as unlikely as it might seem. The Hurricane Repair Organisation would often recycle or amalgamate major parts from 2 or more damaged aircraft to create one serviceable Hurricane. It's unlikely that the truth will ever be revealed, but with or without the Kingston centre section, proof does exist that Z7015 was the 93rd Canadian Hurricane completed by the Canadian Car and Foundry production lines. It made its maiden flight from Fort William Airport on the 18th of January 1941. By a stroke of luck, the original test flight documents were found in 1994 and sent to David Lee by David Birch of the Rolls-Royce Heritage Trust. They showed that Z7015 first took to the air on 5 occasions, on the 18th and 19th of January 1941. That these documents should emerge 53 years later is entirely due to an oil temperature problem that Z7015 experienced and which was rectified during test flights. This Hurricane returned to Britain in 1941. and was allotted to Royal Air Force Henlow on the 18th of March, from where it went to another maintenance unit at Kemble. Its brief Royal Air Force life ended on June the 27th, when it went to General Aircraft Limited at Hanworth for conversion to a Sea Hurricane 1B. It was accepted by the Fleet Air Arm at Yeovilton on the 29th of July, 1941.
It went to the first Fleet Air Arm squadron that was equipped with Sea Hurricanes, 880 Squadron, and operated with them, and was due to go on to HMS Indomitable when she was commissioned.
Squadron records show that at about this time, A Flight, under the Squadron Commander Lieutenant Commander FEC Butch Judd, embarked on the carrier HMS Furious for the attack on Petsamo. The rest of the squadron, including Z7015, appears to have visited most of the aerodromes in Orkney and Shetland, under the charge of senior pilot Lieutenant W.H. Moose Martin. After A Flight's return, 880 were based at Sunborough, and the records show that Sub-Lieutenant Hugh Popham flew Z7015 5 times in this period. On the 13th of October 1941, 880 Squadron were embarked onto the newly completed carrier Indomitable. Z7015 left Sunborough, as can be seen in the squadron record book, on the 7th of October. But it's not amongst the Sea Hurricanes that arrived on the carrier. This disappearance from records remains a mystery. The next definite sighting was in April 1942 at David Rosenfield Limited, a civilian repair organisation at Barton, Manchester, where the aircraft appears to have undergone major repairs, including work on the undercarriage.
From December 42 to mid-43, it was on 759 Squadron, which is the advanced fighter school at Yeovilton. And towards the end of 43, it went to Loughborough College as an instructional airframe, which is the other reason it survived.
On the 21st of February 1961, Loughborough College exchanged the Sea Hurricane 1B and a Spitfire 5C for a Jet Provost with the Shuttleworth collection, and Z7015 took its place here at Old Warden Aerodrome amongst these historic aircraft. The Sea Hurricane, now in the guise of a Mark I Royal Air Force Hurricane, and together with the Spitfire, took up position on static display outside Old Warden. Norman Gardner, project coordinator of the Sea Hurricane restoration, encountered it here in the early 1960s. Unbeknown to him then, it was to be the start of a very long association.
The first time I ever saw what I thought was a Hurricane Mark I was when it stood alongside a Spitfire PR-11 adjacent to the gates, which was the entrance to the Old Warden Aerodrome of the Shuttleworth collection. And we were mesmerised. Cool, look at this, a Hurricane and a Spitfire. Oh, they do look operational, don't they? Oh, yeah, the Spitfire looks a bit better than the Hurricane. Yeah, shame they're outside.
The Hurricane remained at Old Warden until 1967, when all Second World War aircraft that could be made serviceable were once again recalled for duties with the Royal Air Force at Henlow. It was here that Norman and the Sea Hurricane were to meet again.
Because I used to help the Royal Air Force riggers and fitters who were working on the Battle of Britain film with us to help run the engine then and blank off the radiator, which actually we never succeeded in getting it airworthy. And incidentally, I might say at this point, what a good job. Because we didn't know at that time that the Hurricane tailplane spar was as corroded as it was. So there's some weird and wonderful things happen.
The radiator failure prevented certain disaster. Had Z7015 flown for the cameras in 1968, the tail spar would have disintegrated. Following the Battle of Britain film, the Sea Hurricane returned to Old Warden and remained there on static display until 1975, when its path and Normans were to cross again at the Doughty Airfield, Staverton in Gloucestershire.
The late 1970s, when I worked for my sins, I was working for the Doughty Flying Unit as its service manager under the direction of Squadron Leader Neville Duke, of Hawker Hunter fame in particular. And I think it was largely due to Air Commodore Wheeler's association with Sir George Doughty that Doughties were asked if they could possibly help in the restoration of the Sea Hurricane.
Air Commodore Alan Wheeler, Shuttleworth's aviation trustee at the time, had earlier engaged Doughties to refabric the collection's Gloucester Gladiator and had been impressed with the results.
Unfortunately, although there was no obstacles put in our way, by the time we got to the tailplane of the Sea Hurricane at that time, we found it totally corroded. There was absolutely no hope, after all sorts of inquiries throughout the UK and the world, of replacing the tailplane spar, and that particular project fell through. And that was a great disappointment to me, and the aeroplane was taken in bits back to Old Warden.
And there it remained until 1981. Apart from the wings, which were restored by British Airways at Heathrow in 1980, in readiness should a restoration of the airframe be successful.
The Shuttleworth collection were looking for somebody else to take on and work on the Sea Hurricane restoration. They approached us and we said, yes, all right, we'll give it a go. So the aircraft came across here in pieces, basically, in 1982, I think it was.
The Hurricane had arrived at the Imperial War Museum and went into what is now Hangar 5, and some volunteers, quite keen chappies from DAS, started working on the airframe.
That team never really worked, or never really got together to really achieve very much, mainly because we didn't put very much resource into it. We hadn't got much to put into it. Really, I suppose I deliberately said, until we can get a proper team and a proper funding arrangements, then it's never going to happen.
A new agreement with Shuttleworth was reached in 1986, and Norman Gardner was appointed as project coordinator.
I said to David Lee, who was deputy director here at Duxford, what's happened to the Spitfire crew?
This particular crew was responsible for this beautifully restored Spitfire Mark 5C belonging to the Shuttleworth collection, and had worked on several other restoration projects that included the Shuttleworth Anson and Spitfire PR-11.
But they were reluctant to get involved in another Shuttleworth aircraft.
I suppose David Lee takes quite a lump of recognition for his efforts to get this Spitfire crew working, so that they eventually, I hope, will become known as the Sea Hurricane crew.
First assembled in January 1986, in what for the next 8 years would become known as the Sea Hurricane Workshop. Keith Taylor, crew chief and Merlin engine specialist, thought their involvement with the Sea Hurricane would only be brief.
We was going to do the engine only for a start. That was when we found out we'd got the wrong one. Yeah. And we got this one in, and somehow we ended up with all of it. I don't know quite how that happened, to be honest, but well, when we first saw it, it wasn't a Hurricane. It was just lots of T-chests and lots of spare bits.
Steve McManus, deputy crew chief, had tried to get his hands on the Sea Hurricane in the past.
The Hurricane was sitting over at Old Warden looking rather forlorn, and we went over and asked whether we could do that. And they said, no, that's already going down to Staverton to a team down there. So when we got involved with it, it was like a giant airfix kit without any instructions.
Well, initially, of course, the first thing one does, and the crew didn't need any supervision on this, was to do an inventory on what bits there were left, because it wasn't by any means complete by this stage, having travelled all over the country.
Before restoration could start, the previous attempts at rebuilding the centre section and fuselage had to be dismantled for inspection.
The rear end of it, where it had been sitting down in the grass, was quite heavily corroded. A lot of the steel tubes were quite heavily corroded. And some effort had been made to let them go with certain repairs around them. For instance, they put clamped plates around some of the tubes to try and reinforce them, but when we looked at them we thought, well, that's only building in trouble for the future, so the best answer is to take it totally to pieces, which is what we did.
And the lads started working on decorroding all the tubes, and some of them were so pitted, so corroded, pitted, that if you'd have removed it, you'd have gone right through the wall of the tube. So it was decreed that we should replace them. Now, you can't do this without reference to a licensed engineer, and this was where Mr. Norman Chapman was involved and retained by the Imperial War Museum as the licensed engineer on the project.
Norman had also acted as licensed engineer on the crew's previous Spitfire project. They knew that his contribution to the project was not just his CAA recognition. He also brought with him years of first-hand knowledge of veteran aircraft, stretching back to his first involvement with Hurricanes in 1940.
All I'm virtually doing is to see that the lads are putting the right bolts in the right holes at the right time, you know. Yeah. And that's what it's basically is tied down to, is certification of all the bits that go into the aeroplane. Because when I took it over, there was just no paperwork, nothing. So I said, right, we start from scratch.
We literally stripped it to the extent that it was just a heap of tubes sitting around in here, and inspected every tube, cleaned it inside and out, and then made the decision whether the tube was a goer or not.
You know, we didn't even know what the parts were in many cases when we picked them up.
In fact, we did have one party of people came in here some years ago and said, we heard you got a Hurricane in here. We said, yeah, you've just walked over it.
The Spitfire crew were now turning into the Sea Hurricane crew. But how the vast differences in construction of the two aircraft caused them any problems?
The Spitfire's construction was, I'm going to get shot down, I know, but it was simpler for a modern trained engineer to work, to put together. It was a simpler method. It was modern.
Absolutely different from a Spitfire. A Spitfire is all stress skin structure, all metal structure. This one is a generation before, a steel tube forming the structural members of the aeroplane, then wood formers to give it shape, stringers that you can then locate the fabric on, and then a fabric covering.
There were one or two heads scratched about, well, surely they didn't do it like this. How did they do? They got tubes inside it.
Having made a detailed inventory and assessed the condition of the major components, the crew then began reconstruction in 1987. The first major task was to replace the 4 corroded longitudinal fuselage tubes that run from the cockpit to tail. In line with the standard Hawker procedure, the tube ends had to be squared. This was the crew's first major challenge.
The original tube squaring machine had only just recently been dismantled by Hawkers at Kingston, and we were stuck.
That was difficult. It took us about 6 months to solve, to get a machine up and running that would actually work and square the tubes to the dimensions we wanted.
Anyway, 2 engineers who were doing part-time work on the airfield under contract came up with a wonderful idea, which was as near the original as it possibly could be, and we were able to square the tubes. This gave a great impetus because, of course, this allowed us now to rebuild the whole of the fuselage.
During 1987, the undercarriage legs, doghouse assembly and radiator were sent away for refurbishment as parts requiring specialist attention, and the crew concentrated on the Hurricane's centre section and fuselage.
Replace, refurbish everything you could on the fuselage primary structure, the tubular structure which the layman never sees because it's covered over.
We started to reassemble with new tubes as necessary. First of all with the centre section, and then the fuselage structure around the pilot's area and engine subframe.
A lot of work involved, a great deal of work, because the structure is wire braced. It has crisscrosses where you true up the structure you've now built, And that's quite involved.
We gradually sort of built from the centre section backwards until we arrived at the back end.
A problem the crew knew they would have to face eventually was the irreparable corrosion in the tail spar that had halted the first restoration attempt at Staverton in the late 1970s.
Luckily, there were other Hurricanes in the same problem, and Cranfield College had done a mod where they replaced the rolled steel spar with a circular spar and put plate webs on the side. And really, because we didn't tackle it immediately, but we left it sort of hanging up on the ceiling for a while, by the time we got round to looking at it, Cranfield already had a solution, and it was just a case of shipping it over there and getting it done. During 1988, the primary structure was rebuilt, complete with the centre section containing the fuel tanks and the radiator, rebuilt by Cambridge Radiator. The next major problem was woodwork. Originally it was going to be rebuilt for us by a firm called Morris Bayliss, but unfortunately we only got as far as the doghouse with them, and because of timescales we had to bring the woodwork back here and do it ourselves.
With the assistance of the museum, we were able to engage a skilled and licensed aircraft woodworker, and he came, and by Jove, he made a big difference.
And we set up all the jigs on big pieces of plywood to make all the various shapes and formers. Luckily, the originals, though virtually falling to pieces, were good enough to be able to take patterns off, and we just left them rather long if they were a bit broken at the ends, and sorted it out when we fitted it to the aircraft.
Many months were spent laying out the wood frames and offering them up to the fuselage until they fitted correctly. And by the time the doghouse assembly returned in 1989, the Sea Hurricane was beginning to look like an aeroplane once again. In 1990, Keith Taylor's major challenge on this restoration started. His task was to make the original Merlin III engine serviceable.
That's a piston, and it's got about a 6-inch stroke. There's 12 of these in there, and they're in a V formation, 2 rows of 6, 6 there, and 6 over this side. These are the valves, and as you can see, there's 4 per cylinder. There's 2 inlet valves and 2 exhaust valves. They open, they come out there into exhaust stubs. This is the camshaft that works these valves through the medium of these fingers. They ride on the camshaft proper, which is driven by that wheel. That's obviously the heart of the engine. All crankshafts are in all engines, of course. It comes up to the reduction gear, up to the front, and this is a big wheel which is turned by a small wheel, which reduces the speed of the propeller to about 2.5 times. But I think you know to a certain extent when you're putting it together, you see what you've got, so to speak, and we know the engine is good, everything is correct, and in fact the chap that actually helped design it has been down and looked at it.
We had to call on the services of Alec Harvey Bailey, who was sort of Mr. Merlin at Rolls-Royce during the war, to come and give us his opinion on the condition of the engine.
He's certified that it's more or less as good as new.
Fortunately, the CAA were happy to accept his recommendations.
During the 18 months the engine refurbishment took to complete, work continued on the rest of the airframe. The electrical and hydraulic systems were now installed in the centre section, and work continued on the wooden frames. By September 1991, the Merlin III was rebuilt and finished in its original Rolls-Royce paint scheme, ready to be reunited with the Sea Hurricane. After years of work, the wooden formers were now ready to be placed permanently on the fuselage. First, the wooden frames or formers are attached to the steel tubes that run from the centre section to the tail, and then the long, thin longerons that support the fabric are joined onto the frames. While the woodwork progressed, the tail section was sent to Shuttleworth, where Chief Engineer Chris Morris supervised the refabricing of the control surfaces. Back at Duxford, the team set about one of the more unusual aspects of this restoration, the arrestor hook. Whilst in service, Sea Hurricanes had a simple method of hook deployment, release the hook, and it dropped ready to catch the wires on the carrier deck. It would be clipped back into place by riggers on the deck. But for safety reasons, Z7015's hook had to be capable of being deployed and retrieved from the cockpit during a display flight. Several ideas were thought up and tried until they hit on the idea of a pneumatic valve, operated by the pilot, that pushed the hook out against a spring. Releasing the pressure brings it back into its retracted position. During this period, the team inspected the wings. These had been refurbished by British Airways long before this restoration project started, and following a detailed examination were found to be in need of cleaning and painting, but otherwise fully serviceable. It wasn't until early 1993 that Chris Morris and Andy Preslant could come over from Shuttleworth to start replacing the outer fabric. This process, known as bagging, requires the Irish linen to be draped over the fuselage, stretched over the formers and longerons, and then be stitched in place. Once the fabric is in place, 6 coats of red dope are applied, each coat drying and shrinking the fabric to the wood to give a smooth, taut, aerodynamic finish to the fuselage. The process is finished with a final coating of silver dope, ready for spraying with the camouflage scheme. The team had known all along that this project couldn't be finished in the workshop, and as work progressed, the Sea Hurricane got bigger and the workshop smaller. Before the wings could be fitted or the undercarriage extended, Z7015 would have to move into the restoration hangar. On the 13th of March 1994, the Sea Hurricane left the workshop, where it had arrived 8 years before as a collection of corroding metal and unusable wood, and took up a new position in Duxford's restoration hangar. For the first time since restoration started, Z7015 was taken off its temporary legs and was able to stand on its refurbished undercarriage. Over the next few weeks, a mass of jobs were carried out on the airframe, the legs were resealed, and the wings that had been taken off so many years ago were replaced. The painstaking job of reaming out for the wing root bolts was to take until the end of June 1994. Once on and secured, the wings were painted, the propeller was replaced, and now, for the first time, the Sea Hurricane looked very close to flight. On the 23rd of July 1994, Duxford Aerodrome echoed to a sound not heard there in many years. The team's work on the engine had paid off, and on the second attempt, the world's only working Merlin 3 burst into life. The work was not over yet, though. Several more engine runs were needed, and a growing list of minor jobs and adjustments were necessary before the Sea Hurricane would be ready for flight. During the autumn of 1994, a party of very distinguished visitors came to Duxford. In 1941, they'd all served with 880 Squadron of the Fleet Air Arm, and as such, they had a special reason to see the last remaining Sea Hurricane. Paddy Brownlee, Jack Gibson-Smith and Hugh Popham all flew Sea Hurricanes during World War II, and Hugh even flew Z7015. Today, the Sea Hurricane has been restored exactly as the aeroplanes they flew on the Malta-bound convoy Operation Pedestal, as a tribute to them and to the many men who lost their lives in that desperate struggle.
I'd actually flown this thing,
What strikes us most is the size of it.
It's quite extraordinary, actually.
We have no recollection of it being anywhere near as big as this.
No, extraordinary.
And the problems of even getting into it.
That's partly old age, Jack.
Well, it must be old age.
They get progressively worse the older you get.
But having trained just before going on the Hurricanes on battles,
So was I, yes.
I think we were absolutely thrilled to fly the Hurricane. That's my memory.
Yes,
really.
how right you are, yes. And the thing about this one, it had a decent strong undercarriage, which the Seafire did not have.
Yeah. I think it was much more robust, really.
Really much robust, much stronger airplane altogether.
Yeah. I think probably the most dramatic episode in all in each of our 3 lives was actually the climax of Pedestal.
Operation Pedestal was the last big convoy sent in August 1942 to resupply Malta. The tiny but vital island had endured months of unrelenting air attacks by shore-based Luftwaffe units from Italy, Sicily and Sardinia. The convoy of 14 merchant ships included the tanker Ohio, carrying vital fuel supplies for Malta's own Spitfire, Hurricane and Swordfish squadrons. The merchantmen were protected by the battleships Rodney and Nelson, aircraft carriers Victorious, Eagle and Indomitable, carrying Paddy, Hugh and Jack in 880 Squadron. At 2000 hours on the 11th of August, Indomitable Sea Hurricanes were scrambled for the second time that day to intercept incoming hostile aircraft.
We were caught up in the sort of dusk attack on the fleet, and we'd been up flying for an hour plus, and we'd been involved with some Ju-88s.
That's right,
and our fuel was very low, to say the least of it. And the fleet were firing at us anyway. Every time we
got near the fleet, they fired at us.
And the tracer were coming up like this, going,
all my tanks were eating north, no question about it.
The last memory I have was this man saying, "I'm out of fuel. I can see the shadow of a carrier below me. I'm going to make a pass at it." And it was Victorious, who at that particular moment was steaming downwind, so the captain being on the board tried to turn into wind.
It started to turn
into wind. The result was that Hugh made the pass at the carrier, and of course, as it was turning hard to starboard, he overshot the flight deck and came in from the starboard beam. And by the grace of God, there were 2 Hurricanes parked on outriders. They were very effective landing gear, actually.
Landed in the middle and immediately caught fire.
Yeah. And is alleged to have then gone up to the commander flying, saluted smartly and said, "Please, sir, I've just landed on."
Paddy and Jack found their ship despite the almost impossible conditions, and Hugh remained stranded on Victorious for the remainder of the operation.
It was a terrible night, because I hadn't got an airplane, so the next day I was out of it, really.
And Jack and I managed to get back to Indom, and
one way or another.
And here we are, the 3 old Contemptibles.
Of the Hurricane side.
Even though the Navy lost the carrier Eagle and 2 cruisers, and only 5 merchant ships out of 14, including the tanker, made it through to Malta, Operation Pedestal was deemed to be a success and kept the tiny island of Malta supplied so as to fight on against almost impossible odds. During the winter of 1994-95, a new and unexpected problem emerged with the propeller. One blade was found to be loose in its adapter. For a while, it looked as if this would mean a long delay, but then a set of blades was located and acquired by the museum. The original hub and new blades were refurbished and assembled by Michael Barnett of Skycraft, and eventually returned to Duxford on the 24th of June to be refitted and tested in an engine run on that day. On the 23rd of July, Shuttleworth test pilot John Lewis arrived at Duxford for Z7015's first taxi test. And for the first time in many years, Z7015 was mobile under its own power. All that remained now was for the CAA to inspect the Sea Hurricane and, if satisfied, issue a permit to test before it could fly. Over the years, Norman Chapman and the team had certified every part, component and assembly of the restoration. These all had to be checked and approved. This meticulous attention to detail paid off on the 5th of September when the CAA's inspector spent a day with the team going over the Sea Hurricane and its accompanying mountain of paperwork. The 17th of September 1995 is almost exactly 54 years and 8 months since Z7015 first flew in Canada. Almost 45 years after that, the Sea Hurricane team started work on this aeroplane. And exactly 9 years, 9 months and 9 days later, they would hope to see it fly. Mid-morning, Rolls-Royce test pilot Andy Sefton arrived from Old Warden.
We'll do a ground run, just to try out the handling of the engine, provided everybody is happy, including myself. I'll taxi out. If I'm happy with the taxiing, then I'll get airborne, which will be out in that direction. I'll try and turn her before we hit the concrete, but if it doesn't turn very well, I don't want to go through that bad patch over there, so I'll take her onto the tarmac and taxi on the tarmac.
Probably lift off about 12:30.
Yeah,
We're off.
Sefton has many hours on Spitfires, but had never before flown a Hurricane.
Similar types of flown are the Spitfire P-51 and the Bearcat. In terms of power, it's not as powerful as the others, but exhibits the same handling characteristics. The idea of a test program is to prove an airplane, to make sure it's safe to operate. On the first flight, all you're trying to do is make sure the thing works basically.
Hotel, take off your discretion, the wind is northerly 5 to 10. Randy, roger. Your flight is approved, surface wind northerly at 10. Hotel, land at your discretion, northerly 10.
You want the after-flight smile now?
Oh, yeah. Not the grimace.
Not the in-flight grimace that I normally give. That's good. Thank you. But well done. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's good. I need a cup of tea. How about you?
I've got over that, now it's landed.
Yes.
I'm very, very happy.
It's 9 years, 9 months, 9 days since we started the restoration.
Shall we do another one, Mr. Lee?
No. Can't afford to do another one.
The Sea Hurricane team's dedication to this project and their determination to see this, one of the world's rarest aircraft, fly again, will bring pleasure to and admiration from the thousands of people who will see it fly long after Z7015's restoration crew are gone.